January 1945. Somewhere in the interior of the United States, winter presses against the barracks walls of a German prisoner of war camp. The snow outside is thin and crusted, crunching under the boots of sentries who pace along high fences of rusting barbed wire. Inside the compound, the air smells of coal smoke, wet wool, and the faint sourness of overused mess tins. Rows of low wooden buildings sit in rigid formation, their windows filmed with frost, their doors scarred by countless hands. In one of these barracks, the prisoners are strikingly young. Faces that should belong to schoolboys, not soldiers, lounge on rough bunks. Their uniforms are faded field gray, sleeves rolled, hair cut to regulation length, but their movements still carry the restless energy of late adolescence. When word spreads that the American camp commander, a U.S. Army captain, is reorganizing their days, the reaction is immediate. They laugh. Not bitterly, but with scornful amusement at the thought of discipline that includes classrooms and examinations behind wire. They had come here as fighters of the Reich. Now someone is telling them they will finish high school. To understand how this strange order became possible, the story has to pull back, far beyond the fence line of a single camp. The story begins long before the snow and barbed wire of that American camp. In January 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, many of the boys who would later sit on those POW bunks were toddlers learning their first letters. Within months, the new regime set about reshaping what those letters would spell. Classrooms, playgrounds, and youth clubs across Germany were absorbed into a single purpose: to form a new kind of German youth. Hitler had said it bluntly, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." The words were not a slogan, they were a program. In ordinary towns and villages, school books changed. Geography lessons dwelled on lost territories. Biology classes taught racial hierarchies as if they were laws of nature. History was retold as a story of betrayal, humiliation, and the promise of rebirth under National Socialism. At the same time, uniforms began to appear on schoolyards: brown shirts, black shorts, triangular scarves. The Hitler Youth, which had been a marginal movement in the late 1920s, expanded at a dramatic pace. By 1936, membership for Aryan boys was in practice compulsory. Those born in the mid-1920s, the cohort that would later fill POW camps as teenagers, moved from Jungvolk at 10 into full Hitler Youth at 14. Almost as automatically as they advanced from one grade to the next in school. The line between education and indoctrination steadily disappeared. Parades and camping trips were fun on the surface: songs around campfires, hikes through forests, games of mock combat. Beneath that surface, a harder training took shape. Boys learned to march, to handle dummy rifles, to throw grenades made of wood. They were told repeatedly that they belonged to a chosen generation destined for struggle and sacrifice. Teachers reinforced this in the classroom. Some did so enthusiastically, others more cautiously, but the curriculum itself left little room for doubt. Physical education hours rose, religious instruction waned, critical thinking was not encouraged, obedience was. When war began in September 1939, the boys who had marched in Hitler Youth columns watched their older brothers and fathers depart for real combat. Early German victories in Poland, in Norway, and France confirmed almost everything their leaders had promised. To a 14-year-old in 1940, the world seemed to be unfolding exactly as the songs had said it would. As the war expanded into the Soviet Union in 1941, into North Africa, and against the United States in 1941-42, the demands on German manpower grew. Casualties on the Eastern Front mounted to levels that civilian newspapers only hinted at, but families understood from the silence of letters that never arrived. By 1942, the military began dipping deeper into the younger age groups. The Luftwaffe called on schoolboys to serve as anti-aircraft auxiliaries. At 15 or 16, they stood behind heavy guns around cities like Hamburg and Essen, tracking the sound of Allied bombers in the night sky. Their school day was split: mathematics and German in the morning, flak duty in the afternoon and evening. Some still did homework by the light of blackout lamps between alerts. In 1943, an entire SS armored division, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was formed largely from boys born in 1926. Their officers were experienced SS men, their rank and file had come straight out of the Hitler Youth. Their training emphasized fanatical loyalty and attack at all costs. Many had never held a job, never voted, never known a Germany without swastikas. The regime shortened the distance between classroom and front line with each passing year. By 1944, with the Red Army pushing through Ukraine and Belarus and Anglo-American forces preparing to land in Western Europe, conscription norms eroded further. 17-year-olds were drafted as a matter of course. Volunteers claimed to be older than they were. Birth certificates were ignored or reinterpreted. The priority was rifles in the line. When Allied forces came ashore in Normandy in June 1944, these teenage soldiers faced them. Units on the German side included not only the Hitlerjugend division, but also infantry and Luftwaffe field divisions containing undertrained, underage troops. Many fought with courage born of indoctrination and peer pressure. Many died. Those who survived often did so by being wounded or captured. The same pattern unfolded in Italy after 1943 and along the collapsing Western Front in late 1944, as American and British armies drove toward the Rhine. Patrols and rearguard units were increasingly composed of boys who, in another world, would have been finishing their secondary examinations. In October 1944, with the frontiers of the Reich shrinking, Hitler proclaimed the Volkssturm. All males between 16 and 60 were liable for service in this last-ditch militia. Photographs from those months show exactly what his decree produced: old men in World War I coats and thin-faced boys in school caps clutching Panzerfausts. The traditional rhythm of adolescence, exams, apprenticeships, university prospects was shattered, classrooms emptied under the pressure of mobilization. Some teachers followed their pupils into uniform, others stayed, trying to maintain lessons against the sound of air raid sirens. By the winter of 1944-45, the Third Reich relied heavily on these semi-educated, heavily indoctrinated teenagers to slow an enemy that was materially and numerically superior on almost every front. When these young fighters surrendered or were overrun, they did so after a childhood molded for loyalty and a youth spent preparing for war instead of adulthood. They went into captivity carrying two things in their minds: a truncated education and a worldview crafted by a dictatorship. Many of them would be loaded onto ships and sent thousands of kilometers away to a country they knew only through propaganda and rumor. In those distant camps, the question would arise: what responsibility did the captors have toward the education of these boys, now prisoners of war? For the United States, the appearance of these German boys in captivity was only one strand of a much larger phenomenon. Prisoners had begun arriving years earlier. In 1942, the war on the Atlantic sea lanes and in North Africa produced the first substantial groups of Axis POWs in Allied hands. Crews from damaged U-boats, soldiers captured in Tunisia, airmen shot down over occupied Europe. They all had to be held somewhere, fed, guarded, and treated in line with the Geneva Convention of 1929. Britain, already strained by bombing and manpower shortages, did not have unlimited capacity for large, long-term camps. The United States, by contrast, had space, food, and relative safety deep inside its own territory. So Allied planners reached a decision that would change the landscape of rural America: ship tens of thousands of POWs across the ocean. The first contingents arrived in the summer of 1942. By 1943, trains were unloading weary, watchful German and Italian prisoners at sidings in Texas, Oklahoma, the Midwest, and the Deep South. They were sent to camps hastily erected on army bases, fairgrounds, and unused land. By the end of the war, roughly 425,000 Axis POWs, the vast majority of them German, would pass through camps in 46 U.S. states. On paper, their treatment followed the Geneva Convention. They received rations comparable to those of American troops not at the front. They could write letters home. They could organize sports and concerts. Crucially, the convention also allowed them the right to intellectual and educational activities so long as security was maintained. That clause, initially almost an afterthought, would later become the legal doorway for something more ambitious. At first, the U.S. Army's main concern was discipline in the narrow sense: preventing escape, maintaining order, and ensuring prisoners completed the labor tasks assigned to them. POWs picked citrus fruit in Florida, harvested wheat in the Plains states, cut timber, repaired roads, and worked in canneries. Their wages, paid into camp accounts, could be spent at small canteens stocked with basic goods. But inside the compounds, out of earshot of the American guards, another hierarchy ruled. Among the German prisoners, men with strong Nazi convictions quickly moved to dominate camp life. Former party functionaries, SS veterans, and convinced ideologues formed informal leadership circles. They enforced their own code with threats and increasingly with violence. Prisoners who criticized Hitler, listened too eagerly to Allied news broadcasts, or showed defeatist attitudes were labeled traitors. Intimidation gave way, in some camps, to murder. November 1943, at Tonkawa, Oklahoma, this shadow war became impossible to ignore. A German prisoner named Johannes Kunz, suspected by fellow inmates of being too friendly with the Americans and of informing, was beaten and strangled by other POWs. His killers tried to stage the death as suicide. U.S. investigators quickly saw through the deception. Courts-martial followed. Several perpetrators were sentenced to death and later hanged at Fort Leavenworth. Tonkawa was not completely unique. Other camps reported beatings, threats, and mysterious accidents targeting prisoners who questioned Nazi doctrine or cooperated too openly with camp authorities. The message within many compounds was clear: even in defeat, the party line must be enforced. For American officials, this posed a deeper problem. It was one thing to house enemy soldiers. It was another to allow hardcore Nazis to run effective terror networks inside the wire, particularly when a portion of the prisoners were teenagers whose personalities and beliefs were still forming. Suppressing violence through stricter discipline and segregation was necessary, but it did not resolve the underlying issue. What ideas would these men carry back to Germany when the war ended? By 1943, a handful of officers and civilian experts in Washington began to encourage a different approach. Within the War Department, the Special Projects Division was created and stationed at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island. Its official mission sounded innocuous: to provide intellectual diversion for prisoners of war. In practice, its staff, including German-speaking academics, exiles, and intelligence officers, saw an opportunity to test whether information and education could loosen the grip of National Socialism on at least a portion of the captive population. They worked carefully within the boundaries of the Geneva Convention, which prohibited overt political indoctrination of POWs. Instead of lectures against Hitler, they produced a camp newspaper, Der Ruf, The Call, written in German and presented as a forum for honest discussion about the war and the future of Europe. They prepared booklets on history, economics, and democratic institutions. They supplied camps with films, many of them documenting life in the United States, Allied war aims, and gradually evidence of Nazi crimes. Participation was voluntary, at least formally. But access to this material could be controlled by camp authorities who, in turn, answered to American officers interpreting directives from Washington. At the same time, the Army began separating hardcore Nazis from more moderate or apolitical prisoners. Men with visible party tattoos, SS runes, or records of fanatic behavior were transferred to more tightly controlled camps, often in remote areas. This left a larger number of men, among them the younger POWs, in compounds where it was at least possible to create a different internal climate. Within this framework, the idea of more structured education emerged. In some camps, German prisoners themselves requested classes in foreign languages, technical subjects, or preparation for university. In others, American commanders, confronted with growing numbers of 17 to 20-year-old captives, looked for ways to keep them occupied beyond work and routine roll calls. Army education and recreation officers drew up syllabi. German teachers among the prisoners were identified and vetted. Libraries were expanded with textbooks and neutral reference works. What began as scattered initiatives evolved into proper camp schools. Some offered courses comparable to German gymnasium or vocational programs. Exams were held, certificates were typed and stamped. The goal was twofold: to reduce boredom and discipline problems and to send these men back to Europe better prepared for civilian life. For teenagers who had known only Nazi schools and Hitler youth drills, this presented both a challenge and a shock. Attendance was often met first with sarcasm or outright refusal. Many clung to the belief that the Reich would somehow recover, that they would be exchanged, that their duty was still to the front, not to algebra and literature in captivity. To change that attitude, discretion from Washington had to be translated into concrete orders at camp level. That task fell to American officers, often captains, who commanded individual compounds or companies of guards. They were the ones who decided how strongly to encourage school attendance, how to enforce discipline, and how to shield willing students from the resentment of the diehards. In the dead of winter 1944-45, in camps scattered across the American interior, those decisions converged on the question that had once belonged to village headmasters and parents in distant German towns. Would these boys finish their schooling? In one such camp, under the watch of a single U.S. captain, the answer would be shaped by a new kind of discipline that reached beyond drills and punishments, into the realm of classrooms and examinations. They arrived in America, still wearing the posture they had learned in Germany. For many of the teenage prisoners, the journey itself blurred into a sequence of disorienting images: the stunned moment of capture under shellfire, the tense days in makeshift cages in France or Italy, the crowded troopship crossing the Atlantic, guarded by men whose language they did not speak. When the gangways finally went down on American soil, some craned their necks to glimpse the harbor. Others kept their eyes fixed ahead, as they had been trained to do. On the trucks and trains that carried them inland, they compared stories. One had been a flak helper near Cologne, eyes burning from sleepless nights at the guns. Another had served as a radio operator in a panzer division barely out of trade school. A third had lied about his age to join the Waffen-SS, his voice broken mid-sentence when he boasted about it. They talked about the Eastern Front, about Allied bombers, about the rumors of new wonder weapons that would turn everything around. Beneath the bravado lay a more fragile reality. They were cut off from their families. They did not know who was alive or dead at home. Their world had shrunk from battlefields and ideological slogans to the length of a camp street. Some hid their unease behind loud declarations of loyalty to Hitler. Others retreated into silence. A few, especially those captured late in the war, already sensed that the Reich they had pledged themselves to was collapsing. They entered the camps with a teenager's mix of defiance and confusion, carrying unfinished educations and a discipline forged in youth organizations that had never imagined defeat. Facing them on the other side of the command post desk stood men like the American captain in charge of their compound. He was not a policymaker in Washington. He did not draft memoranda on re-education or speak at conferences on the future of Europe. His daily concerns were simpler and more immediate: the guard roster, the state of the perimeter fence, the condition of the barracks roofs before the next storm. Yet through the orders that reached him, he held a quiet power over the shape of these prisoners' days. In the morning, he might inspect the work detachments, checking that headcounts matched the lists. At noon, he might sign off on requisitions for coal and medical supplies. In the afternoon, he would read reports from his sergeants: a fight in Barracks 7, a confiscated homemade radio, a prisoner hospitalized after a fall from a truck. His training had taught him to think in terms of security and efficiency. Now, new directives added another layer: the need to occupy the minds of the men behind the wire. He read, perhaps with some skepticism, the circulars from higher headquarters about classes, libraries, and informational films. He knew that some of his guards scoffed at the notion of school for Nazis. Others were quietly curious. The captain's responsibility was to interpret these orders into specific routines: which hours of the day could be devoted to classes, which buildings could be converted into makeshift classrooms, how to square it all with his primary duty not to lose a single prisoner. There was also the moral tension he could not entirely avoid. He commanded teenagers only a few years younger than some of his own men. They wore the wrong uniform, had fought on the wrong side, and some of them still shouted slogans he found repulsive. Yet when he saw them lining up for mail call or soccer matches, they looked uncomfortably like the high school boys back home who had enlisted or been drafted. He was under no illusion that he could change their minds by himself. But he could decide whether their days would sink into boredom and resentment or be filled with something more structured. The American captain's dilemma was not only how to keep order, but what kind of order to enforce. Order in most camps began with the basics: a bugle or shouted call at first light, roll call in the cold, prisoners counted in tens and hundreds as they stood in rows between barracks, breakfast in the mess halls, coffee substitute bread, sometimes oatmeal or potatoes. Then the work details marched out under guard, boots beating a steady rhythm on frozen ground or dusty paths depending on the season. Those not assigned to outside labor were kept inside the compound, under the eyes of sentries in watchtowers. On paper, this looked like simple military routine. In practice, two overlapping systems of discipline coexisted. One was American, rules posted on boards in German and English, punishments for infractions ranging from loss of privileges to confinement in the camp jail. The other was German, enforced not by guards but by fellow prisoners. Barracks leaders, often selected informally by the strongest political groups, assigned bunks, controlled communal spaces, and kept an unofficial watch on attitudes. A careless word at the wrong time could mean a whispered warning, then a beating, perhaps worse. The American officers knew that something was happening inside the barracks, but they did not always see the details. They saw the results: bruised faces explained away as accidents, sudden shifts in prisoners' willingness to participate in camp activities, rumors of threats against those who attended film screenings or discussion groups. For the teenage POWs, this double discipline was a constant pressure. On the one hand, the Americans insisted on punctual roll calls, neat bunks, and orderly queues. Violations brought predictable consequences. On the other, the older German hardliners demanded ideological conformity. Skipping a Hitler birthday observance or expressing doubt about final victory could mark a boy as suspect. When talk of classes and organized education began, it collided with this internal order. To cooperate too eagerly with an American initiative was, in the eyes of some prisoners, an admission that one accepted defeat, that one was willing to be shaped by the enemy. The U.S. captain understood, at least in outline, that he was not simply managing bodies but contending with an invisible structure of loyalty and fear. Mere punishment could silence open defiance, but it could not, by itself, free the younger men from the grip of those who still believed the swastika would rise again. To change that, discipline would have to be tied to something more than regulations and barbed wire. It would have to reach into the very space that the Nazi state had once claimed as its own, the realm of youth and education. Turning a prison camp into a school began with simple physical changes. In some camps, a mess hall was cleared after breakfast and transformed. Benches became desks. A sheet of plywood painted black hung on the wall as a chalkboard. Shelves were knocked together from scrap lumber to hold donated or army surplus textbooks. In others, unused barracks were divided into classrooms with curtains or rough partitions. A hand-lettered sign might designate Room 1, Mathematics, Room 2, Languages. The teachers were, in most cases, German prisoners themselves. Before the war, they had been schoolmasters, engineers, university students. Now they stood in front of their compatriots wearing the same faded uniforms, chalk dust on fingers that had once gripped rifles. American education officers screened them for political reliability. Known party activists were kept away from the blackboard. Those cleared to teach prepared lesson plans, often adapting from memory because proper German textbooks were scarce or outdated. The curriculum followed familiar lines: arithmetic and algebra, geometry, German literature, history, foreign languages, basic sciences. Where possible, syllabi were aligned with pre-war German standards so that, on repatriation, these courses could be recognized as equivalent to missing years of school. Attendance formally was voluntary. In practice, the structure of the camp day could make it feel far less optional. Younger prisoners who were not needed on heavy labor details were told that their place during certain hours was in class, not loitering in the compound. Roll was taken. Names were checked. Those who refused too often might find other privileges harder to secure. Behind this lay an emerging conviction among some American officers that idleness bred trouble and that education could be a form of discipline more effective than any extra guard tower. The line between information and persuasion was thin. From Fort Kearny, crates of printed material and film reels were dispatched to camps across the country. The German-language newspaper Der Ruf, edited by anti-Nazi German prisoners and exiles, arrived in bundles. Its articles described the course of the war more frankly than official Nazi bulletins, reported on resistance movements, and tentatively explored the idea of a post-Hitler Germany based on law rather than dictatorship. Pamphlets on economics, political theory, and modern history supplemented the standard school subjects. They were careful in tone, avoiding overt appeals that could be classed as illegal propaganda under the Geneva Rules. Instead of denouncing, they compared election systems, constitutional structures, the functioning of courts. They asked questions where Nazi textbooks had given answers. Screenings in the camp cinema huts followed a similar pattern. Newsreels showed American cities, factories, and farms. Feature films, some light entertainment, some more serious, presented a society that did not match the caricature of degenerate democracy the prisoners had been taught to despise. Later in the war, when Allied governments decided that concealment was no longer useful, films documenting concentration camps and mass graves were added to the repertoire. Reactions varied: shock, disbelief, denial, silence. American officers insisted that these materials were not forced upon anyone. Attendance at screenings and discussion groups was, on paper, a matter of choice. But when a captain scheduled a film during the evening when work was done and the compound gates were locked, choosing not to attend could mark a man as conspicuously aloof. The classroom itself reflected these tensions. A lesson on world geography that mentioned colonial empires and trade routes might prompt questions about the causes of the war. A civics discussion about checks and balances in the U.S. Constitution might lead a teacher to contrast that with the enabling act that had given Hitler dictatorial powers. The Americans did not write the words on the chalkboard, but they controlled which books sat on the shelves and which topics were available for study. For the teenage prisoners, this produced a slow, sometimes grudging exposure to ideas that their earlier schooling had deliberately excluded. Outside the classroom, a different kind of education unfolded. The America they encountered beyond the wire was not the one they had seen in Nazi newsreels. Guard detachments included men from cities and farms, Catholics and Protestants, descendants of German immigrants, and in some cases, black soldiers whose very presence contradicted myths of a racially degenerate United States incapable of order. On work details, the young POWs saw grocery stores with full shelves despite rationing, children playing in backyards untouched by bombing, and farmers discussing market prices instead of air raid warnings. Some were astonished to find German books in local libraries, classical music on the radio, Goethe and Schiller on American reading lists. The portrayal of the United States as a cultural wasteland rang hollow against these daily impressions. Yet they also noticed the contradictions. In the southern states, they saw segregated buses and whites-only signs. Some were unsettled to find that in certain situations, prisoners of war could sit in places where black American civilians could not. Letters home when they arrived described cities in Germany reduced to rubble, families displaced or missing. The contrast between their own relative safety and the devastation in their homeland gnawed at them. These experiences chipped away unevenly at the edifice of certainty built in their Hitler youth years. A fair-minded guard who bent a rule to allow an extra letter. A camp doctor who treated a sick prisoner with the same care he gave his own men. A local farmer who, after months of work details, addressed a POW by name instead of simply shouting German. None of these small encounters overturned an ideology by themselves, but they created hairline cracks. Within the barracks, those cracks showed in subtle shifts. A boy who once laughed at the idea of school might begin attending classes regularly, explaining to his comrades that he only wanted the certificate for later. Another might borrow a book of poetry from the camp library, ostensibly to improve his language skills but linger over its themes. A third might lower his voice when repeating a rumor of German defeats, but no longer dismiss such stories out of hand. The Nazi hardliners understood the danger of these small defections. They watched who read what, who spent evenings in the classroom rather than at the card table, who lingered after a screening of dare rough articles. When warnings failed, they reached again for fear. In one camp in Oklahoma, that fear would culminate in the killing of a fellow prisoner, forcing the U.S. Army to confront the limits of its tolerance and to reconsider with new urgency how discipline and education should intertwine behind the wire. The November night at Tonkawa was cold and still. The camp lay on the flat Oklahoma plains, a rectangle of light and shadow under a wide sky. Floodlights bleached the barbed wire in pale arcs. Guard towers pricked the darkness at the corners, each manned by an American with a rifle and a silhouette of bored vigilance. Inside the wire in one of the German compounds, another kind of watchfulness prevailed. For weeks, rumors had circulated among the prisoners about an informant, someone they believed had been talking too freely to the Americans, betraying escape plans, repeating careless jokes about Hitler and the war. In the tight, enclosed world of the POW camp, where news was scarce and pride fragile, the idea of a traitor gnawed at the men who still considered themselves frontline soldiers. Suspicion settled on one figure, a U-boat sailor, seen speaking more often than others with interpreters and camp officials. There were whispers that he had given away details of an escape tunnel, that he had accepted cigarettes and favors in return for information, that he no longer believed in the Reich. On the evening of November 4, 1943, a group of fellow prisoners led him into a barracks room under a pretext. What followed took place out of sight of the American guards, behind thin wooden walls and over the noise of the wind. The alleged informant was beaten mercilessly. Blows fell until his resistance crumpled. Then, to mask the murder, his killers staged the scene to resemble a suicide. When they were finished, they left him hanging. The alarm came later, when someone reported the body. American medics cut him down, but there was no question of revival. Military police noted the bruises on his face, the marks on his body that did not match a simple hanging. Photographs were taken. Statements were collected from witnesses who hesitated, then gradually began to talk. The story that emerged was not one of despair, but of execution by his own comrades. Tonkawa forced U.S. authorities to admit what some had already suspected, that, in certain compounds, the Nazi Party still governed by fear. Investigators from the Army Judge Advocate General's office descended on the camp. They questioned dozens of prisoners, cross-checking accounts looking for inconsistencies. Some witnesses claimed to remember nothing. Others repeated the same formulaic explanation, but under sustained questioning, details shifted. A few younger men, disturbed by what they had seen, described the assaults more honestly. A military commission was convened. The defendants were German POWs identified as ringleaders of the attack, some of them former party functionaries inside the camp. The proceedings took place under tight security. The charges were grave, premeditated murder. Though the accused insisted they had only enforced discipline, the evidence of brutality was compelling. In the end, several were sentenced to long prison terms. A group of the main organizers received the heaviest penalty, death. They were transferred to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the U.S. Army maintained a military prison and an execution chamber. In the summer of 1945, after the war in Europe had formally ended, they were hanged. The Tonkawa case sent a shiver through the camp system. Reports of intimidation and violence among POWs, once treated as internal matters unless they directly threatened American personnel, were reclassified as security threats. The War Department could not justify allowing organized terror inside its own facilities, especially when international law required it to protect prisoners from harm. A new policy took shape. Known or suspected hardcore Nazis were to be identified and separated from the general population. Intelligence officers reviewed camp rosters, paying closer attention to tattoos, membership in SS units, previous roles in party organizations, and behavior since capture. Men who had led clandestine courts or orchestrated attacks were moved to special compounds, often in more isolated locations. The goal was not only punitive, it was strategic. By removing the most fanatical elements, American planners hoped to create an environment where less committed prisoners, especially the younger ones, could think and speak more freely. If the constant threat of being labeled a traitor receded, perhaps a boy who had doubts about the war would dare to voice them. Perhaps he would be more willing to read a newspaper that did not echo the party line, or to attend a class that asked him to consider a world beyond the myth of the Thousand-Year Reich. Tonkawa also hardened American attitudes about the limits of tolerance. Some officers had previously regarded political activity among prisoners as an unavoidable nuisance, best handled by keeping a lid on obvious disturbances. After a man was murdered for supposed disloyalty that seemed naive, discipline within the wire had to be more than roll calls and punishments for missing work. It had to break, or at least weaken, the shadow state that had taken root in the barracks. At the same time, repression alone was clearly insufficient. You could lock up the ringleaders. You could forbid certain meetings, confiscate Nazi insignia, ban unauthorized assemblies. But the ideas that had animated those actions remained lodged in the minds of many inmates, especially those who had grown up with them. A 17-year-old who had spent half his life in Hitler Youth units would not simply abandon that worldview because an American captain posted new rules on a bulletin board. Within the War Department's Special Projects Division, Tonkawa and similar incidents were read as confirmation that a purely negative approach, suppressing harmful behavior, had to be paired with a positive program. If you did not offer an alternative framework of meaning, you left a vacuum that nostalgia and resentment would eagerly refill. That alternative, they believed, lay partly in education. In the months after the Tonkawa verdicts, circulars went out to camp commanders reminding them of their authority to organize schooling and intellectual activities, particularly for younger prisoners. Segregation of hardliners was to go hand in hand with the expansion of libraries, lectures, and formal classes. The message was clear: discipline should not merely contain but direct. For officers on the ground, like the captains who ran individual compounds, this translated into new orders and new possibilities. They now had both a warning and a mandate. The warning was written in the photographs from Tonkawa and the execution reports from Fort Leavenworth. Unchecked Nazi control inside the barracks could end in murder. The mandate came in the form of instructions and resources to shape a different daily life, especially for the boys and young men whose futures might still be written. In one camp, that mandate coalesced around a single, concrete decision: that the teenagers who had laughed at the idea of discipline would not only stand roll call and march to work, but would also sit at wooden tables, open notebooks, and complete the schooling a collapsed regime had left unfinished. In late 1944, in several camps across the American interior, the new policy took written form. On the bulletin boards where work details and meal times were posted, an extra sheet went up. It carried the camp commander's signature and the bland language of army orders, but its message was clear enough. All prisoners below a specified age, usually 20 or 21, who were not assigned to essential outside labor were to enroll in the camp school. Attendance would be recorded, absences would be noted. In one such camp in the Midwest, the reaction among the teenage Germans rippled through the barracks with a familiar mix of mockery and unease. Some scoffed openly at the idea of kinderkram, childish stuff imposed by the enemy. Others joked that the Americans were simply running out of work for them. A few, quieter, wondered if finishing their schooling might actually be useful, but kept those thoughts to themselves. They were used to orders, they had grown up under them, but being told to go back to school by a foreign officer cut against the self-image many still clung to. They were soldiers, not pupils. The U.S. captain in charge of the compound read the reports of resistance without much surprise. He had allowed the education officer and German teachers to explain the program first, to present it as an opportunity. Now, backed by directives from higher headquarters, he shifted the tone. For young prisoners inside the wire during class hours, idling in the yard was no longer an option. The schedule would show them either in the classroom or on a work detail. Repeated refusal to follow the timetable could mean loss of privileges, confinement, or transfer to a stricter camp. It was not physical coercion at gunpoint, but within the closed world of the POW camp, it felt to many like compulsion. The first morning of classes began with a kind of grudging procession. Columns of young men in field gray jackets walked not toward trucks and fields but toward the low building that had been a mess hall. Inside, the tables were aligned in rows. A blackboard had been fixed to the wall. On a small platform at the front, a prisoner in a neatly brushed uniform waited, a stack of papers and a stub of chalk in his hands. He had been a teacher in a German gymnasium before the war. Now his students were fellow captives, some only a few years younger than he was. American guards stood at the doors, rifles slung, not inside the room but close enough to discourage any attempt at disruption. Their presence, and the knowledge that hardcore Nazi agitators had already been removed to other camps, gave the more hesitant boys a thin layer of protection from peer pressure. Roll call was taken, this time with pens and notebooks rather than rifles and canteens. The opening lessons were deliberately practical: arithmetic problems on the board, grammar exercises, simple reading comprehension. For many of the teenagers, the material was both familiar and distant. They had last sat at desks 2, 3, sometimes 4 years earlier before mobilization and air raids had fractured their schooling. Some realized with a jolt how much they had forgotten. As the days became weeks, the school's structure solidified. Classes were divided roughly along the lines of the German system. Those who had nearly finished their secondary education before the war entered more advanced courses. Others, whose schooling had ended at lower grade levels, followed parallel tracks aimed at a WWII, the intermediate certificate. Timetables were posted. Mathematics in the morning, languages and literature after lunch, sciences on alternate days. The curriculum was not entirely free of contention. History in particular was sensitive. The German teachers, many of whom had taught under the Nazi regime but were now carefully watched by American education officers, steered a cautious path. They reviewed earlier periods, the Reformation, the unification of Germany in the 19th century, with relative ease. The years after 1918 and especially after 1933 were harder. Some stuck to dates and facts, letting students draw their own conclusions. Others, influenced by the materials from Fort Kearny and by their own changed perspectives, began quietly to question the narrative of perpetual victimhood and righteous revenge. For the teenage prisoners, the most immediate challenge was more mundane: relearning how to be students. Long campaign marches had conditioned their bodies, not their concentration. Sitting for an hour over an algebra problem, parsing a paragraph of Goethe, or memorizing vocabulary felt strangely exhausting. Their notebooks filled with uneven script, smudged by calloused fingers more used to oil and dust than ink. Yet, as the winter wore on, many found a rhythm. Outside the classroom, the change was subtle but real. Boys who had once spent idle afternoons packing the compound or replaying battles in their conversations now compared test scores. They borrowed books from the camp library, ostensibly to prepare for exams, finding themselves drawn into chapters on topics their earlier schooling had neglected. Comparative government, psychology, modern European literature beyond officially approved authors. None of this meant that loyalties evaporated overnight. Some still wore their party badges when regulations allowed. They spoke with pride of earlier campaigns, of comrades lost. They resisted, sometimes fiercely, the suggestion that the regime they had served had committed crimes beyond the battlefield. But the exclusive certainty of their youth, the sense that there was only one possible way to understand the world, began to fray. The American captain watched this evolution with a practitioner's eye. From his vantage point, one metric mattered immediately: discipline. Since the school program had become part of the daily routine, incidents of fighting and insubordination among the youngest prisoners had declined. There were still tensions, still arguments in the barracks, but fewer brutal beatings, fewer reports of clandestine courts punishing supposed defeatism. The school had not abolished the invisible German hierarchy, but it had carved out a space where another authority, that of the teacher of the examination, could operate. In the spring of 1945, as the front lines in Europe collapsed and news of German surrender filtered through the camp radios and newspapers, the POW schools reached a quiet milestone. Examinations were organized. Under the supervision of American officers and using syllabi modeled as closely as possible on pre-war German standards, the teenage prisoners sat for written and oral tests. Mathematics papers were collected and graded. Essays in German and foreign languages were read and marked. Oral exams in sciences and humanities were conducted by panels of prisoner teachers, their notes countersigned by U.S. education officers. Certificates were prepared. Typed on army forms or camp letterhead, stamped and signed, they recorded the bearer's name, date of birth, the subjects studied, and the level of achievement, equivalent to completion of middle school, sufficient for entrance into university study or similar formulations. To a boy in a barracks bed, the paper felt both weighty and fragile, a promise with no clear guarantee. Word spread nonetheless that post-war German authorities might recognize these credentials. No one knew exactly how. Germany itself was now under occupation, its institutions shattered. But the possibility that months spent at a wooden table in an American camp could shorten the road to a diploma in a rebuilt homeland gave the effort a new meaning. For the American captain, the transformation was measured less in certificates than in atmosphere. The teenagers who had once laughed openly at the idea of being sent back to school by their captors now formed study groups in the evenings. They still lived behind barbed wire. They were still prisoners, subject to orders and to the uncertainties of repatriation. Yet the discipline that had begun as an imposed schedule had become, for many, a path out of the war's arrested adolescence. Only later, when the gates finally opened and ships carried them back across the Atlantic, would the full consequences of these classroom hours become visible. The war in Europe ended not with a bang inside the camps, but with a change in the sound of the loudspeakers. In early May 1945, as radios crackled with bulletins from London and Washington, American officers assembled the prisoners on the parade grounds. The announcement was brief. German forces had surrendered unconditionally. There would be no more fronts to return to, no last-minute counteroffensive. For many of the teenagers who had just sat their examinations, the news confirmed what their lessons and the camp newspapers had already implied, but hearing it declared aloud still landed like a physical blow. Some cheered quietly, relieved that the killing was over. Others stood rigid, eyes fixed ahead, the posture of soldiers without an army. In theory, the end of the war should have meant an early journey home. In practice, repatriation was slower, tangled in logistics and politics. Allied nations needed labor to rebuild roads, clear debris, and harvest crops. Shipping space was limited. Germany's own cities lay in ruins, its administration now in the hands of occupying powers who were wary of releasing millions of trained soldiers back into a country still reeling. So the school routine in many American camps continued even after victory in Europe. Summer replaced winter. The mess hall classrooms were stuffy rather than cold. Lessons expanded to include more practical subjects: accounting, engineering basics, agricultural science. Some camps established short vocational courses alongside the academic tracks, aimed at men who knew they would not pursue university but would need skills in trades that would be vital during Reconstruction. For the young prisoners, the strange interlude of captivity stretched on. They read fragments of news about their families in censored letters and Red Cross messages. Town names appeared in print: Cologne, Dresden, Königsberg, attached to statistics of destruction. A boy who had studied geometry in the morning might spend the evening imagining whether the street he had grown up on still existed. The abundance of food and stability in the camp no longer felt merely surprising. It could feel at times like an accusation. Gradually, the transports began. In late 1945 and through 1946, trainloads of German prisoners left American camps under armed guard, their duffel bags stuffed with what little property they possessed. Spare clothes, letters from home, a handful of photographs, perhaps a well-thumbed book. For those who had attended the camp schools, another item slipped into the stack, a folded sheet of paper or two, stamped and signed, listing completed courses and examination results. Not all would go directly back to Germany. Some were transferred first to Britain or France to fulfill labor quotas before eventual release. Others, especially those captured later or with particular skills, remained in the United States into 1946 and 1947. But the general movement was one way now, toward a homeland they had left as soldiers and would re-enter as former prisoners. The Atlantic crossing, this time, felt different from the first. On the earlier voyage, they had been combatants sunk in uncertainty, scanning the horizon for enemy submarines. Now they stood at the railings with a different weight in their minds. The United States receded behind them, its camp barracks, its classrooms, its contradictions. Ahead lay ports under Allied control, reception centers, and then trains snaking through a Germany they barely recognized from the hints in their letters. For many, the first shock came when the trains slowed on the outskirts of German cities. Where they had once pictured dense neighborhoods and familiar skylines, they saw gaps, blocks of rubble, broken church spires, facades without roofs. Stations functioned, but in a makeshift way. Platforms were crowded with civilians in patched clothing carrying bundles. Children stood in lines for soup near hastily erected kitchens. Signs were in German, but the uniforms of the authorities were now British, American, French, or Soviet. Homecoming in such a landscape was rarely a single moment of embrace on a platform. Some found parents or siblings waiting, haggard but alive. Others arrived to learn that their families had been killed in air raids, or had fled from territories now annexed by Poland or the Soviet Union, or were missing in the confusion of the last months of war. Former teenage prisoners who carried camp school certificates suddenly had to navigate housing shortages, ration cards, and the bureaucracy of occupation zones before they could even think about formal recognition of their studies. Post-war German authorities, both local and regional, faced an enormous educational backlog. An entire generation's schooling had been disrupted by war, evacuation, and mobilization. Buildings that had once housed gymnasium and vocational schools were damaged or destroyed. Textbooks printed under the Nazi regime were, in many subjects, no longer acceptable. Teachers themselves had to be vetted in denazification proceedings before they could return to the classroom. Into this chaos returned young men who had, in an odd inversion, completed parts of their education not in German towns but behind American barbed wire. In some regions, education officials examined the documents these former POWs brought, course lists, grades, endorsements by camp education officers, and agreed to treat them as equivalent to missing years of schooling, at least for the purpose of entrance into new programs. In other cases, men were allowed to sit special examinations that took into account what they had learned in captivity. The procedures varied between occupation zones and later between the emerging federal states, but the pattern was clear. Camp education, though unofficial in origin, became a stepping stone. For the individuals involved, that paper in their pocket could mean the difference between returning to casual labor and qualifying for an apprenticeship, between being locked out of higher study and gaining entry to a university rebuilding its lecture halls. They had gone to war as Hitler Youth in uniform. They came back as ex-prisoners, some with the equivalent of high school diplomas earned under the watchful eye of an American captain whose name they might not even remember. The young men who stepped off repatriation trains in 1946 and 1947 did not return to the same country they had left. In the Western zones, a new political vocabulary was taking shape. Words like basic law, lender, and parliamentary democracy appeared in newspapers distributed under Allied supervision. Political parties reformed or were founded anew: Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Liberals. In the Soviet zone, different structures emerged with a tightly controlled party landscape. Everywhere there was talk of denazification, of guilt and responsibility. Of a zero hour from which a different Germany might begin. Former POWs from American camps arrived into this conversation with a particular set of experiences. They had lived for months or years under rules written and enforced by a foreign military power that nonetheless insisted on legal procedures and some measure of rights, even for enemies. They had attended lectures on constitutions and elections, read newspapers that criticized governments without fear of immediate arrest, seen debates in which disagreement did not automatically imply treason. None of this turned them instantly into Democrats, but it provided reference points that many of their contemporaries inside Germany lacked. Sociological surveys conducted in the 1950s and 1960s comparing former prisoners held by different allies would later suggest a pattern. Those who had spent captivity in the West, particularly in the United States and Britain, were often more willing to accept the legitimacy of the new democratic institutions in the Federal Republic than those who had survived harsher conditions and political schooling in the East. Many ex-POWs testified that camp schools, libraries, and discussions had been their first sustained encounter with concepts like the separation of powers, free press, and individual rights not subordinated to a total state. The impact of that encounter was most visible not in headlines, but in careers. Some of the teenagers who had grudgingly attended high school behind barbed wire sat, a decade later, in overcrowded lecture halls at new or rebuilt universities in cities like Bonn, Hamburg, or Munich. Their POW certificates had helped them bridge educational gaps, gaining admission they would otherwise have been denied. They studied engineering, medicine, law, teaching. Others entered teacher training colleges, bringing a mixture of traditional methods and the quieter conviction that schools should never again serve as instruments of totalitarian indoctrination. In village classrooms and urban gymnasium, former POW pupils became teachers of a new generation, one that would grow up under the basic law rather than the Führerprinzip. Still others applied their camp-acquired skills in technical trades and administration. A man who had learned bookkeeping in a POW course found work in a municipal office managing reconstruction funds. Another, who had taken basic engineering or agricultural science classes, contributed to rebuilding bridges, roads, or modernizing farms in a country desperate to feed itself. Their stories rarely mentioned the American captain or the army forms that had once certified their studies. Yet traces of those decisions ran through their post-war paths like faint, persistent threads. The picture was never uniformly bright. Many ex-POWs carried bitterness alongside their certificates, bitterness at long captivity, at the destruction of their hometowns, at the stigma that sometimes clung to them as those who surrendered. Some rejected the political lessons of their camp years, retreating into private life or clinging to myths of a clean Wehrmacht separated from the crimes of the regime. Others, especially those who had endured brutal treatment in Soviet captivity before eventual release, emerged with deep scars and a hardened worldview. Within West Germany itself, the process of confronting the Nazi past moved in fits and starts. For every former prisoner who quietly tried to live by the democratic principles he had encountered in an American classroom, there were officials and professionals who had served the old regime and now adapted themselves to the new order without fully reckoning with their complicity. The influence of POW re-education programs, including the camp schools, ran alongside these larger, more ambiguous currents. But in aggregate, the numbers mattered. By the early 1950s, millions of men who had spent formative years in captivity were integrated into West German society. A significant subset of them had passed through the structured educational programs created in Allied camps. They were voters, parents, colleagues, supervisors. Their attitudes toward authority, law, and politics shaped dinner-table conversations and workplace cultures. In memoirs published decades later, some former teenage POWs recalled the moment when a U.S. officer had told them that schooling in the camp was not optional. At the time, they had felt humiliated, treated as children. Only much later did they connect the notebooks on their bunks with the lives they had been able to build after the war. The professions entered, the exams passed, the capacity to read political news with a critical, informed eye. The American captain who had insisted on filling their days with classes rather than emptiness seldom appears by name in those recollections. He remains, at most, a shadowed figure at the edge of their memories, an officer at a desk, a signature at the bottom of an order, a distant presence behind the guard who called them to their first lesson. Yet in the quiet arithmetic of history, his enforcement of discipline through education helped tilt the balance for a fraction of a generation, nudging some of Hitler's former schoolboys toward a different adulthood. When the boys first laughed at the idea of school behind wire, they thought they were defending their dignity. To them, discipline meant drill squares and shouted orders, not chalkboards and homework. They had been raised to believe that adulthood arrived with a uniform and a weapon, not a notebook and an exam. The American captain's insistence that they sit at tables and conjugate verbs felt in that moment like an insult added to defeat. Yet war has a way of rearranging what counts as strength. The same century that produced mechanized slaughter and industrialized murder also produced, inside prison camps, a stubborn belief that even enemy youth should know how to solve equations and read history beyond slogans. It was not charity. It was policy, strategy, calculation. But within that calculation lay a hard-earned recognition that ideas outlast barbed wire, and that the future of a beaten country would be built most durably in its schools. There is an unease that runs through this story, and it should not be smoothed away. Captors compelling the education of captives carries an inescapable tension. The line between enlightenment and imposed influence is narrow. The United States did not run disinterested classrooms in those camps. It curated curricula, chose books, framed discussions. Yet against the memory of classrooms in the Third Reich, where biology proved racial destiny and history ended in a single leader, the imperfections of the camp schools take on a different weight. In the end, the measure lies less in intentions than in what those former prisoners did with what they had been given. Some forgot their lessons or rejected them. Others folded them quietly into lives spent far from politics, in workshops, offices, clinics, and ordinary homes. A smaller number carried them into public roles in a new republic, where the distance between a dictatorship of their youth and the institutions of their middle age could be traced, in part, through the worn pages of POW exercise books. The barracks and fences have long since vanished, their outlines blurred beneath new fields and roads. The boys who laughed at discipline grew old, then disappeared, their stories scattered in archives and family recollections. What remains is the paradox they embodied, that in the middle of a total war one side chose to answer fanatical schooling with compulsory education of its own, and that in doing so it helped turn some of its youngest enemies back into students. Not with banners and parades, but with the simple, stubborn act of turning pages under a guard's watchful eye.